Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Carlos Moncada, Director of Client Services at InfoReady. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for this Peer Spotlight webinar featuring our guest panelist from the University of Pittsburgh, Ryan Champagne, who is in the Office of Sponsored Programs. Also, just special thanks because I know this is a busy week for everyone trying to wrap things up before the holidays. So the fact that you're with us means you care. All joking aside, a little overview of Ryan and what he'll be discussing today. So he's going to be sharing both the high-level concepts and the nitty-gritty details of designing competitions in InfoReady Review with data collection in mind. I'm sure all of you have thought, about the inputs and outputs related to that process of creating competition. So you'll get a lot of good information today. And the webinar today is scheduled for 60 minutes. Around 25 minutes, give or take a few, will be for the presentation, and then the balance will be for Q&A with Ryan, our panelist. As a reminder, the phones are muted, meaning that any questions you'd like to ask panelists should be submitted through the question and chat option. The other thing is that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available within the next couple of weeks on our website. That will be an edited version. An unedited version will be automatically emailed later today. So you can have that on demand and share it with your colleagues who weren't able to attend. There's also a post-webinar survey. If you'd be so kind as to fill that out, that would be lovely. We've also attached a few handouts for you. One of those are the presentation slides. So if you look in the webinar control panel, that should be open. There's three handouts actually. One is the presentation slides, and then we have a couple documents in there. They're kind of quick start documents for creating competitions and creating routing steps. Some of the topics Ryan discusses will correspond to items you can find in those documents as well. And we also have a couple poll questions in there as well, if you care to fill those up. Now, having covered the housekeeping items, I will turn things over to our panelist from Pitt, Ryan Champagne. Ryan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you for inviting me for this. So yes, designing competitions with data collection in mind. If you want to advance, what my intent is to share with others how, through building competitions, we can plan ahead for future work. So what sort of data points do we want to have to be able to quickly synthesize into future metrics to look at program performance? How do we want to plan for those analytics? What sort of quick grab materials can we pull out of InfoReady to be able to share with our leadership? And how can, when a quick question crosses my desk that might not be so quick to answer, how can I make it as quick as possible? Next slide. So yeah, welcome to the University of Pittsburgh, home to the tallest educational building in the Western Hemisphere, the Cathedral of Learning. It really does have a nice view from the top, looking out over some museums and parks. If nothing else, the stairs are a great workout. Next slide. The University of Pittsburgh was founded in 1787. We have 5 campuses located across the western half of the state. The university is an AAU public institution, and we are an R1 very high research university. The total head count of students from our fact book is close to 35,000. this is pulling in part-time in all campuses. We also have a faculty head count of 5,571, same source, which is included in our 14,000 all employees. So basically, this university is a small town, is one way to think of it, and that to even make a quick decision about, you know, having Skype for Business also be our phone line is like introducing an entirely new amenity. So implementing something like InfoReady Review has also involved some pretty big thinking and implementation. Also, we're competitive, so we want our things to work well, and we're held to a high standard. I know rankings are always debatable, but we are the 18th public university by U.S. News and World Report and 57th in the United States. Ready for next slide? In doing this, we go through a lot of research dollars. This is taken from our fact book, so it's out there online. But what we're looking at here is, as of the most recent reporting out, about $940 million in research expenditures in our most recent fiscal year. This is a listing of where that lies, and we can see that we have a med school, and we are the 5th most funded university by the NIH. So that's that top number of over $400 million of sponsored research. Next slide. So this means that we have a lot of limited submissions across the board, but again, we are the 5th most funded NIH medical school in the country, 7th in federally financed R&D funding, and this all falls under the purview of our Senior Vice Chancellor for Research, Dr. Rob Rutenbar. Next slide. Pitt Research is our group of organizational entities within our research infrastructure. So it's a cluster of 6 offices, each office with sub-offices and teams, which includes myself, our research development team of 2 here, myself and my colleague Bradley Pollock. You know, this is our 3rd year as an entity of Pitt Research. So for an old university, still a relatively new organizational structure that we're still crystallizing, and therefore I think we get asked a lot of questions as to, has what we've been doing before we were an entity matter? How does it matter? What are we doing new, and what does that look like compared to previous efforts to seed funding, to effectively coordinate limited submissions, and to coordinate with other offices? Next slide. We're now in our 4th year. Well, we've completed 4 years of having a license of InfoReady Review, and it has really grown with time. When it started, this was our limited submission solution and a couple of seed grants. Now we have more than 12 offices using our license in an administrative capacity, and we're handling everything from awards being made to incoming students, so people who are not yet officially in the Pitt community, to our Chancellor's Distinguished Awards for our up-and-coming, or actually kind of already arrived early career, as well as our highly prestigious accomplished faculty. So we really have a pretty healthy variety of use cases, and that continues to grow. Just this morning, I had a meeting about having another office join us. And you can see a little bit of a mix down here. So what this looks like, this year, doing a year-to-year look, we're running about 50% more competitions than we were a year ago. So we are seeing that use grow. We overall last year had 130 different competitions as a combination of student funding, faculty seed grants, staff seed grants, and limited submissions all run through here. We now have more than 4,000 users with review accounts, and yes, 15 and growing number of offices administering this. So that also involves a little bit of administrative effort on my end and on Bradley's end. And also thinking with people as to how they might want to design competitions to meet their goals. So next slide. Just another way of showing in that, there's a pretty good variety here. We have, in our list of competitions here, I believe that is an NIH limited submission at the top with nobody applying. We have Provost Award and mentoring below. So we're intermingling a lot together here. Next slide. So we also have a lot facing out and to work with. So today I'm going to try to focus on some things that have been helpful in reporting about our use case of InfoReady, about specific subsets of competitions, or even a specific program. You can see here that I work with a lot of templates. It's helpful to carry stuff over year to year, and we also do a lot of copying competitions. I'm pretty particular about naming conventions, and we'll talk about that a little bit because that just becomes another data point. So next slide. So in designing competitions for data collection and being able to review things, when we're working with limited submissions, this is one of the most critical spaces for accuracy and data going in to then report out. We need to inform what's outward facing to our applicants so that people are aware as to they're applying to the right program, and also for our future use to run reports of what people have applied to in InfoReady versus what people have applied to in our Huron-Click system. So our proposals going out of the university. And one of the best ways to do that is to be accurate in terms of using federal solicitation numbers. It's a unique identifier, so not really open to interpretation, where we may refer to the same grant program differently across the university or even across universities. The NSF instrumentation program is sometimes referred to as that, as the MRI, as the major research instrumentation program. But one thing that I know that it will always be referred to is an NSF solicitation number. And that's how it's also going to appear in our proposal data. So that is kind of the beginning of baking data into our competitions. Always being able to refer back to authority information in our outward-facing pages is also really important to back this up. Ditto on having PDFs of our competition files. While maybe not the type of granular data point that we're thinking of, it can be really handy for future solicitations that recur to be able to go back to prior year announcements and materials so that we can compare year over year if there are any programmatic changes on some limited submission programs. Next slide. When we're looking at our seed grant programs, we can see that we have a pretty good variety of what's happening. And I pulled this up because we have 130 programs that run through here, but that doesn't mean that all 130 are busy. And as Carlos and his wonderful support team sometimes learn from my hurried emails, sometimes some competitions mean more to me than others. So, for example, that Momentum Fund that's at the top is a new signature initiative of my leadership. So that is my priority. And boy, did they hear about it. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah and Deb. Next slide. So with these important programs, it's safe to say that I'm going to have questions to answer, and I'll need to have functional information coming in as part of applications. Before we worked with InfoReady, and even when we first started, a lot of how information was collected was purely as PDF documents, which is super handy, but it also doesn't let the data live too much outside of the document. And it also meant that a lot of back-end reading and coding had to be done to get some optics into who's applying to our programs. I now bake that into the demographics or the kind of applicant requirements for our applications. We're really on top of having our academic units listed as part of our primary organizations and including relative account information so that our administrative staff can very quickly work across offices to disperse funds. But we also want to capture the centers and institutes that might not be in there because they aren't apparent in our organizational hierarchy. So I always leave an open field underneath the primary organization so that if someone is expecting funds to be dispersed to something other than an academic unit, we can capture that and not hold up anyone in the application process. We've started collecting faculty position information and defining that as multiple choice questions and work off of our HR guidelines to be compliant with the titles that are dictated by the university appear as such in our competitions, and we have them as select discrete options so that it's another way to sort data and see how many non-tenure stream faculty are applying to sea grant programs, for example, or staff positions for that matter. Another data point that has been really nice to collect has been faculty websites at the time of application. This can be a really helpful way to enhance our reviewers' understanding of one's career beyond the CV. And we're also collecting at the time of application is information about the applicant, who their department administrator is, so that if we're making an award, we can get right to that person and disperse funds as quickly as possible. Next slide. When it comes to our applications, particularly for our seed grant programs, we might have breakout committees and ad hoc reviewers who are going to be working with all of our proposals that come in. So this gets built in as questions, multiple choice questions that allow for some sorting on the back end. Our applicants in the performing arts most likely won't be reviewed by the same applicants who are coming to us from the School of Medicine. So having a drop-down category that allows faculty applicants to opt into different review groups has been really helpful in being able to expedite moving proposals outward, but then also for back-end program analytics. We have different levels of award, seeding grants, planning grants, larger proof of concept grants. So these are also considered as valuable sort items. We're more interested in how the university's portfolio of seed funding is, what it looks like. So we're starting to ask people yes, no, as to whether they're receiving funding from elsewhere at the university for these projects. That's never used as a review criterion. It's never viewed as anything other than a means to just understand how we're investing on a project across programs. And we're also asking if people have plans to do so to future apply to other programs. I didn't highlight it as an arrow at the bottom, but we provide a budget template, which is pretty handy, but it's also really nice to ask for a high-level budget number, just the sum at the front end of an application, because I have spent time going through 20 different PDFs trying to find budget requests. That certainly informed my having this question here. It's also really helpful to be able to take this budget request and compare it on the back end, requests versus awards, to be able to calculate the percentage of funded awards. Next slide. Expanding on the budget, this year over the summer I spent time reviewing a couple of years of seed grant programs and the budget requests that came in to try to understand where our resources were being allocated. And I'm not including this as part of an application now, but we'll have it as some back-end work, we've provided a template for faculty to fill out so that budget information can then easily be entered in, either by myself, a student worker, or Bradley for our awardees. So I guess the neater way of saying this, these are the 8 or 9 different budget categories that I will be adding some amounts for projects that have been awarded so that we can have a really quick pull down of this data alongside the larger program data as opposed to having to work back and forth off of budgets. But it's hidden at the time of application. I don't want overkill for our applicants. Next slide. Oh, that comments to the administrator. Yeah, sorry about that. I use that very much when we're doing a letter of intent. It is a great data collection tool in terms of questions about the program that can then be synthesized into an FAQ and returned to all applicants who submitted an LOI and also posted as a program document. Okay, sorry about that. Next slide. We're also collecting data by way of our reviews. I guess this is a bit of an abstract way to think about it, but some of the data that we collect is beyond the reviewer. And these are review steps that we're building in, so our pre-review access is a really handy way to hand over the entire stack of proposals to an executive leader who doesn't have administrative access to review. But then also with the OSP to do a little bit of data collection on the back end of a multi-step review process and also generate out the PDFs of the reviews that compile all reviewer comments from steps so that I can then hand executive leadership at the end of the review process and for their decision making all of the review feedback that has been submitted alongside proposals. That was a little long-winded, but next slide. And this is what it gets to look like. This is a seed grant competition that we currently have in play that we're able to, through the application that I just walked through with you, sort out our various review groups and scales and add in our reviewer names and highlight out who is and is not completing reviews. I'm going to have you move on to the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, I don't want to sit on that one too long. We might see who's not getting their reviews done. Having a spreadsheet like that is a little redundant to the review tab on the enhanced application grid. This is a little bit of myself being maybe too trained on the original application grid. So I'm still doing some work there, but I do find the enhanced application grid to be pretty helpful in getting that update. But I'm still doing that spreadsheet of all the names and statuses so that at a glance I can show it to someone and say, wow, there's a lot of red. There's a lot of reviews that aren't done. And that's all through being able to get a view into what's going on. Back end. The back end of a competition is something that's become increasingly important as we're now hitting grants that have closed out. Our seed grants are typically for a 2-year window. So it was last fall that we started to receive progress reports and project reports on them. And it was incredibly valuable to have that information this summer as we did a dissect on what we've done for many years. Our seed grant program is something like 30 years old, but we had never really broken out the data so granularly that, really being able to design for that has helped. So now we're in a space where we're collecting multiple progress reports. All of our budget requests are coming in here and alerting Bradley, alerting our administrative staff that someone has asked for an extension and that we need to work with their budget. We have a progress report that we ask folks to submit at the midpoint of their project so that if nothing else, we can start getting folks to think about if they need an extension, but also if they're running into any administrative hurdles in completing their work, we can address that by learning here. And then also their final project reports, where we're learning about how our funds have impacted their careers and supported scholarly outputs. Next slide. And how we're able to use that is kind of a by proxy. This year, we wanted to really streamline our review process for our new seed grant, our momentum funds, and to be able to take a few years of progress report information and do some sort outs to see, of our awarded faculty, who has submitted a progress report, have they then pursued follow-on funding or publications, and have they already acted as a reviewer in our programs? This gave us a review pool that we were able to tap into so much more swiftly than relying on pure ad hoc decisions for our review process. So this was a kind of unintentional data grab or use of data, but a really handy one. And I think that might be it. Next slide. Oh, yeah. So this is what we've been able to do out of it, and to take a few years of our seed grant funding and turn it into some high-level overviews as to, how one review category performed out of several programs. So we're able to see, I'll just walk through this slide quickly. We're able to see the total amount of funds requested across projects through 2 different programs in 2 different fiscal years, what was actually awarded and the subset of that in one program. Trying to get an idea as to the amount available per award. So, how, if we were to divide out the total funds available versus the number of applicants, but also look at mean award size in different programs, looking at outlier requests, so on, but then also to be able to look at who's applying, our applicant pool. We can see that there's a pretty large concentration towards early career, but then also at the bottom, look at the frequency of which people were requesting funds. So people were largely requesting for student support. This is why that kind of not yet available budget item is something that we'll work with this year. We can see how funds are dispersed across the various organizational units within the university, but then also how awards have been distributed across non-tenure stream, assistant, associate, and full professors, what that funding threshold looked like per award. So really, all of this data collection over time incidentally allowed us to be able to formulate reports like this in less than a week, which was really handy. And now I think that's it. Yep, just to kind of reach back to what what I said we would cover, I hope I did for you. And I believe that leaves us at any questions.
Thank you, Ryan, for sharing all that great information about optimizing data collection and info-ready review. For those of you watching, contact details are displayed on screen in case you'd like to reach out directly. But we also received quite a few questions from people during registration and also here during the webinar. So let's dive into Q&A, shall we? Ryan, are you ready?
Yes.
You ready to be grilled? So the first question relates to one of the fields you had on the application form, and it's that, do all of your faculty have websites? I see that it's a required field.
Our faculty by default have a website as part of their presence on their department's page. So they do, but we also leave that open so that any personal websites that might be professionally inclined are possible to go in. If they have an instance in our faculty information system, that too could go in.
Thank you. Next question. Do you have any tips for setting up the routing or review process with data collection in mind, aside from what you showed on screen?
Yes. Think about if you've been working on the same funding mechanism for a year or two and the final decision making is somewhat hampered in a little bit of indecision, inserting questions that are constructive that might help your uppermost decision maker be able to look at that feedback from reviewers to guide forward. Questions around feasibility are always very helpful, and Carlos, as your team helped this year, and we greatly appreciated having a rubric with some qualitative guide rails alongside a numeric weight is proving to be really helpful.
Ryan, this is actually a follow-up question for me, for the audience. What type of routing step do you most frequently use in, let's say, a seed grant competition?
In a seed grant competition, we're using build your own forms mostly. The flexibility of just getting some really quick yes/no information, as well as some fairly prescriptive, numeric feedback is great, and we can still include space for people to include commentary. If it's something that we have a nomination program that is also internal, and that's a little, we'll say, breezier of a review, just sticking with a really simple comments and ratings combination. So typically 1.
Thanks for expanding on that. I have another question here about the application form. This relates to the topic of budget questions. You mentioned that you don't show these so that in order to not make it more complicated for applicants. So are you going back and entering that information later? Is it you doing it, or is it someone else?
It is going in later, and it will be someone else.
I laughed.
No, it'll be somewhat time intensive, but the template that we used for our budget is also neat and streamlined. However, not everyone used the template, so and asking, unfortunately, not always do applicants look at what they're applying to before the application deadline. So I try to minimize having folks arrive to apply with a lot of prepared documents, only to find out that they have online forms to input. I've had to extend deadlines because people haven't been prepared for that. So I try to be as crisp as I can in our program announcements, but also I minimize confusion, I hope.
So a couple of the topics you just discussed, we actually had some questions submitted in advance. And so the first one relates to, well, the question is, what type of information do you choose to standardize, and what do you leave as a text entry field?
Text entry really is the program or project specific, details that will be coming back to us. So an expression of interest or letter of intent end of it, you're an abstract. at the full application, team, or project descriptions. But the things that are pretty crisp, like, what department are you in? What's your faculty position? Those are a little more prescriptive, because even just asking, for inputting one's employment title, I had a lot of variance. Sometimes it would be assistant professor. Sometimes it would be assistant professor and clinical researcher of blah, that just creating it to be, the 5 data points that we classify as faculty is what I defined in.
Another question. This is actually a two-parter, to be completely honest. How do you choose between creating a field in the form versus simply requesting a file upload?
If I'm going to have to answer questions about it later, it's most likely going to be a field. If I don't, then it's going to be an upload. Right now, we had people upload as part of an application a personnel description, for example, that I wish I had included as a field, because we're now interested in knowing the team size for all of our collaborative proposals that came in. And I didn't have that just as a SWIFT number box or text box.
Next year.
It's on my whiteboard.
We had a question on registration that asked, it was about progress reports, and it said, what type of information do you gather as follow-up during progress reports?
Oh, yeah.
I butchered that.
Yeah, I apologize I didn't get more granular on that. The information that we're gathering that I use is, have you submitted publication, or have you submitted any manuscripts for publication? Have you submitted any grants for external funding? Unfortunately, some of these are all fields that I excluded, so not super helpful. But, is your project going to happen on time? If not, what is your new date? Do you need to modify your budget? Do you need an extension? Those are things that are happening over time. But for the final outcomes, the number of students that you've supported and the dollar amount associated with that, the number of manuscripts, and perhaps DOIs if they've gone to publication, and any proposals that have gone out, and either our internal number or a link to the program to which they've applied. I also solicit, as part of these reports, just qualitative feedback. What was your experience participating in the seed grant program? And that's been really helpful to be able to share with leadership. That's maybe a little less the metrics that we saw on the next slide, but I think a very valuable space to open conversation with our awardees and applicants. And also, an invitation for them to answer yes, no as to their willingness to participate in symposia or any sort of events that we have around these funding mechanisms. And it's been really handy to be able to see that people want to do that. So we're following through and now doing more of that.
That's great. But by the way, for everyone on the phone, in 2020, we're planning on doing adding a few new options in progress reports. So keep an eye out for those. As you can see, they're really handy. Here's another question. Do you post open opportunities, i.e. not limited submissions? And if so, how do you go about tracking who might be applying nominating candidates to those?
Unfortunately, I can't really give much direction here. When it comes to externally funded programs that don't require internal coordination for selection, I leave that to purely just being communicated by way of newsletters and social media that we use, and not posted here, so as to keep this a little tidier to just items that people need to apply to for consideration.
Thanks, Ryan. So we have a question. This one kind of relates to what you mentioned about working with other units. How do you share these ideas with other offices using the system? How do you provide training and troubleshooting?
I'm bossy. No, I'm very thankful that, InfoReady has allowed us to revisit having an onboarding training at the start of this year because our account use had grown so much. And I've been able to share the recording of that alongside the Vimeo links that you had shared with people as they join. So if they've come on after, I make myself and Bradley available, but always remind individuals that there's a help section in the upper right corner of their screen and that your staff is incredibly responsive and supportive. Thank you. But I'm also sharing the administrative guide. Sometimes, though, things happen. We haven't upped our license to have the directory lookup, so we are getting questions about email aliases that we just help people. I've shared templates that I've thought to be helpful and given people a swift walkthrough on how to edit. But generally, for any new office that's coming on, I assume that it'll be 30 to 60 minutes of meeting on the front end to get them interested and up and running.
Thanks for that question. It's interesting. We always get a flavor of that question because you get a bunch of internal feedback on your end, I'm sure. So maybe we need to put something together to share with folks on that. But on to the other questions that have been submitted. How often are you updating your questions on the form? How standard is it?
They're fairly standard. This year, and I imagine the next year will be maybe a little bit more because we have this new funding mechanism that we will be reviewing and seeing what we did and did not use as data points. But a lot of it had stayed the same for a very long time. Our I guess kind of now retired program, the fund still exists, but the program structure does not. We did a review as to how big an application was and thought about all of the questions that we were asking people, made someone do a kind of bogus application, and then thought about the amount of time that we wanted reviewers spending on it, and then figured what information can we cut out of our application because when combined into a PDF, the materials that we were handing over to reviewers were a considerable lift greater than we would have hoped. So sometimes that's a guiding factor in editing stuff out. If we have initiatives that change year over year, that's going to influence some questions. But a lot of it stays the same.
All right, thanks for that. The consistency is good for reporting purposes, that's for sure.
Yes, and actually to that, this is going to be a real boneheaded moment, but I've learned that if I want to add new fields into my progress reports or to my application, that I kind of need to put them at the bottom of the form, because as each row down on a form builder happens, so does another column out in the Excel file that comes out. So the less that I have to do in lining stuff up across competitions in that Excel, the happier I am.
That's a good tip. I kind of want to add something in relation to that. I just found out that if you independently add a field with the same label to two separate competitions, that the system will recognize that in reports, so it won't report out as separate fields. So.
Oh, neat.
Yeah. So now we can geek out over that one. So enough about me being a nerd. Let's move on to other questions here. Do you have infrared microsites, or are there administrators across your campus and offices? Sorry, I'll let you handle that.
We do have microsites, and I think of it as an audience-oriented item, where we have our student opportunities, our university opportunities, so our seed grants that are going to be available to both our faculty and staff, and then just a limited submission site, because there are so many limited submissions that we're tracking that I like to not have them so integrated among our seed grants.
So I'm displaying it on screen to provide context. So this is just a question for me, actually. Which is a follow-up to the one we got. How did you decide to organize the other two microsites beyond limited submission?
Again, to be a little more audience-oriented, so that our honors college was interested in pursuing a license, and you kindly put their office in conversation with my office, and knowing that our license and subscription would grow over time, rather than having our drop-down menu be office-specific, I wanted it to be more, who would be applying, so that we could accommodate more student things than just those from our honors college. Our university programs to be thought of as a university-wide funding opportunities that are sponsored within the university. Who knows with time if we, quote unquote level up, maybe there will be some more microsites, but for now these are the three easy buckets for us to work with.
Thanks for that. Here's a question. This is about limited submissions. Do you track PIs that do not submit post-internal selection? If so, how is that information used to inform future selection decisions?
We're getting there. That hasn't been a directed activity, and I've happenstance encountered some non-follow-through. Unfortunately, it was in a program where we didn't exclude anyone. People weren't selected out, and we had a seat, quote unquote, go to waste. But I think there's some more interest in looking at, if we're putting this effort into limited submission, promotion, fielding materials, selection, and some follow-on support, what does that look like in terms of performing beyond the university? So stay tuned.
All right, thank you. We've got one more question here. This is, if you want our applicants to be able to provide rebuttals to reviewer feedback, have you done this in the system?
Ooh. No, we haven't. And I think that's really gracious of universities that offer that space. If we run into proposals that have come in with some, blaring challenges, missing documents, possibly, or if a reviewer says, did this person know what they were applying to, we may reach out before it travels too far in a review process, and that's about as close to rebuttal as we've been, but otherwise, no.
Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions coming in, so thank you everyone for joining us today.